Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Liz, for the invitation and the opportunity. Of course, I'm sorry I can't be there in person as I have in the past. And it wasn't much of a commute for me except to an adjoining conference room here at the Aspen Institute, where I'm also a senior fellow. So I understand that you all have my slides in your packages. So I'm going to go through those, I'll go through those pretty quick, but you have them as a reference point if you want to look up data sources or whatever. But they are in your packet, and thank you for doing that, Liz. And let me just say these are my own views and not necessarily the view of the Federal Reserve. So I'm moving over to the first slide now of demographics to wealth. And as Liz was saying, we study the family balance sheet at the St. Louis Fed, and precisely because the Great Recession was a balance sheet recession, it was weak family balance sheets really caused families and the economy to tank. That we thought we need to look at balance sheets proactively to understand why they matter for families and why they matter for economic growth. So our contribution to the study of family balance sheets, and there's many other institutions that study them, but our particular contribution is to look at the demographic drivers of family wealth. And we've looked at three in particular, starting with some reports that we published in 2015 based on 2013 data. And we looked at three drivers at the time. One's education, one's race or ethnicity, and one's age or birth year. And then for the new data that just came out last year, which is 2016 data, that's the most recent data that the Fed has, we were able to also add education of parents. Okay, so the survey respondents were asked about the education of their parents. So we now have four demographic drivers that help us really predict quite reliably which families are building wealth and which ones are not. And just to give you the headline, we found that these demographic drivers not only are powerful, but they're more powerful, more predictive than they were a generation ago. And basically, and perhaps not surprisingly, younger, less educated, and non-white Americans are struggling to build wealth. They lost a lot of wealth in the recession, and they still have not recovered it. Whereas older, better educated, and white and Asian Americans, they also lost wealth in the Great Recession, but they have more than recovered it. So these demographic mechanisms, they're like sorting mechanisms. It's sorting people into thrivers and strugglers, if you want to put them into two broad categories. And I want to say that people don't have financial capability, executive function, that they don't make choices, because they do and they matter. We all control our destiny. But these drivers are serving as headwinds and tailwinds. So if you're a thriver, having these demographic features serves as a tailwind. It's easier for you to build wealth. If you're a struggler, it serves as a headwind. So that's really what's going on. So going over to slide 3, what I'm going to start with is just a little bit of a baseline. The most recent data show that the typical American, the median level, has about $97,000 in net worth. All right, and as you can see from the graph, we have still not recovered the wealth that we lost from the Great Recession. But as you will see, the recoveries have been very, very, uneven. Some families have recovered quite a bit, and strugglers, as I mentioned, have not. But I think an important point here is that you have to think of family balance sheets as a really good barometer of a family's financial health. It's a really good predictor of which family can weather volatility, which ones have resilience, built into them. And by looking at balance sheets, you get a real good insight into this idea of resilience. And so that is our contribution to this debate. So I'm going to go through the three drivers very quickly. I'm on slide 4 now on the racial wealth gap. As you can see, the red line is white Americans, and really they're doing very well in terms of wealth. But Hispanic and African Americans really have kind of flatlined over the last 30 years. They haven't really built any significant wealth, while the wealth of whites has gone up. Right now, the gap between blacks and whites is about 10 to 1. If you control for education, for family demographic, and for income, so in other words, if you look at similarly situated blacks and whites, that gap shrinks about 8 to 1, which is still, it's still a significant gap. So that 20% is where we have some flexibility to make difference. That 80% gap that won't go away is really like the cumulative effect of historical and structural discrimination over many years. That's the part that probably won't go away very easily. Moving over to the next slide, looking at education gaps, you can see that we have the largest gap between those who are doing well and those who are not, sorted by education. Those with graduate degrees have a median net worth of $443,000, and those with who are high school dropouts only have a median net worth of $24,000. Only Americans with college or graduate degrees have built wealth in the last generation. No one else has. All right. So the returns to education are just growing and growing, contributing to the wealth gap that we see today. And finally, not finally, but moving over to age, we have another disturbing pattern here. If you look at younger, middle, and older Americans, only older Americans have actually built wealth over the last generation, people over 62. And, their median wealth stands at $200,000. Middle-aged Americans, they were building wealth, but you can see that many of them really took a hard hit with the Great Recession. These are the ones who were invested in the housing market the most, had the least diversified portfolios. And so the Great Recession was a huge hit for them, and they're still climbing back. Younger Americans, as you can see, have flatlined over the last generation. And this isn't, the point here is that, of course, younger Americans have less wealth because they're younger, but the key point here is that younger Americans today have less wealth than their parents or grandparents did at a similar age, okay? And so there's what we call the birth lottery. So an American born in 1970 is likely to have 40% less wealth over their lifetime than somebody born in 1940, all right? So they might be doing better in terms of income and education, but it's not translating into more wealth. So, so we have these huge disparities based on age, race, and education, and you can see how each of these have deviated from that 97,000 median that I first showed you. The last thing I want to say something about very briefly is parents' education. It's the new variable that we have in the Fed data. And you can see here, just by looking at this chart on page slide 7, having parents without college degrees is associated with, the wealth of somebody who does not have college-educated parents is about $98,000, the median net wealth. However, if the respondents had parents who are college-educated or higher, their median wealth was $342,000. And let me just give you one other statistic here, because it's really shocking. There's something called a Head Start effect by having well-educated parents. If you're white and you have college-educated parents, your wealth is 54% higher than it would be if your parents were not college educated. Now, and if you're not white, and this is all non-white groups, if your parents are college educated, your wealth is 253% higher than it would be if your parents do not have a college degree. So there's a huge head start effect from having college educated parents. So this is just to say that we have age, race, education, and parental education really being powerful predictors of who's building wealth and who's not. I don't think I need to say that these are things that you largely do not control, right? So these demographic drivers, they're not pure destiny, but they're getting increasingly powerful. All right, let me transition now. With that as a baseline, let me just say a little bit about what we know about volatility and financial fragility. We have two data sets here. One is called the SHED. It's a survey that comes out every year, over 6,600 respondents. And then we have something called the Survey of Consumer Finances, which the data that I just gave you for that comes out every 3 years, and it's about 6,300 households. I've given you the websites if you want to understand those sources a little bit better. Let's talk about income volatility first, which is slide 9. So about 32% of Americans have incomes whose incomes vary month to month. About a third of all Americans have variability in their income month to month, and about 30% of Americans struggle to get by. This is from the SHED survey. And then 40% of Americans struggle to pay bills because of volatility, and 43% of Americans say that irregular work schedules is the primary cause of volatility. All right, so that's what we know for the SHED. Go to slide 10. We can say, well, how does this break down by race and education? And you can see that Blacks and Hispanics have 40% month-to-month volatility, but that number is 30% for whites. And then if you break it down by education, there's less volatility among higher educated groups. Okay, so sort of mirroring the demographic drivers that I was talking about, we're seeing those showing up in income volatility as well. Slide 11, let's look at financial fragility. And here we're going to look first at the SHED. And this is the one headline that you might have picked up from the news because it was big news in the U.S. 44% of Americans, if confronted with an unanticipated $400 expense, would have to sell something, would have to borrow, or simply would not pay at all. All right. This really shocked a lot of people that we had this much fragility in U.S. households. So really remarkable. It sparked a lot of discussions and a really remarkable insight into how fragile how many U.S. households are really financially fragile. The next two bars down kind of break that number down a little bit, but I won't go into it because I want to leave some time for Q&A. Then if you look at the Survey of Consumer Finances on the right, they asked, well, how many Americans would not be able to get $3,000 from family or friends? And we're looking at 36% of Americans. 36% of Americans could not come up with $3,000 from family or friends, also a really, really high number. And then next slide, slide 12. If you break down financial fragility by age, race, and education, again, not surprising, we have the lowest, we have the highest financial fragility among younger, non-white, and less educated Americans. And you can see that the differences are pretty stark between those three groups based on these demographic drivers. Okay, and the number that we're looking at here is, how many safe and liquid assets do they have? Okay, what's the value of their safe and liquid assets? And you can see that the amounts vary quite a bit, and again are strongly correlated with the balance sheet statistics that I had given you a little bit earlier. We're going to skip slide 13 and go to slide 14, which is the cross-country comparison. Which is the cross-country comparison, and there might be other data out there, but the only data that I was able to find comparing different countries, the question was from an important paper that Lusardi, Schneider, and Tufano did. and it asks, people to come up with $2,000 over 30 days, if some unexpected need arose. And the rates varied quite a bit across countries, and Canada was relatively low. About 28% of Canadians could not come up with $2,000, but the U.S. and the UK over 50%, Germany over 50%. Some of these numbers are pretty surprising, but it does give you a sense of, at least back then, where Canada ranked. In my final slide on page 15, I just posed 3 questions that seem relevant to the symposium. Is income volatility the hidden culprit? I would say that in the U.S., it's not hidden, but it is growing in significance, and that I think weak balance sheets are really a key contributor to that growing, volatility within U.S. households. I think what is hidden in the U.S. Is the fact that we have so many Americans who are still struggling to recover their wealth, right? You might think, oh wow, low unemployment, high consumer confidence, a booming stock market, America's doing fine, but our data show that a lot of Americans still are trying to recover their wealth, pay down their debts, save, stabilize their lives. Second question, why are household finances important to the Fed? I think pretty obviously, when households can spend, save, borrow, and invest, it's good for them and it's good for the economy. It's important to remember that since 2009, 83% of economic growth in the U.S. depended on consumer spending, right? That's how significant consumer spending is. And if families don't have savings and their incomes are volatile and unstable, they're not contributing, they're not spending like they would. So this is a huge component of economic growth. And then the final thing that I'll say, which I mentioned before, is that family finances matter enormously. The recession that we had, as I mentioned, was a balance sheet recession. Too many Americans had too much wealth and home ownership, not enough savings, and too much debt. Brought down the families. It brought down the U.S. economy. So, family finances are critical, and I think it's only because of the Great Recession that the Board of Governors and the Federal Reserve System has gotten much more serious about the significance of the household sector. The final question is, what are some possible responses? I won't say much here because you have a whole panel on that, but I think first and foremost, I would encourage everybody to choose their parents, their birth year, and their race and ethnicity very carefully. Yeah. Anyway, my point being that obviously you don't choose these things, but they're increasingly important. And I think this is something policymakers need to recognize, that the things that really do matter are increasingly out of families' control, and policy needs to compensate for that. I think the other recommendations, I think whatever governments can do to boost incomes through taxes, through transfers, obviously is really important. I'd also say that building up emergency savings and liquidity is probably the most important thing. We have several studies from different sources that you'll hear more about later that all point to one conclusion: families need more liquidity, they need more cushions, they need more buffers. And then finally, I think employers have a really important role to stabilize work schedules and to give workers more predictability. And, that was a big consensus from some work done here, and I'm sure your panelists will say a little bit more about that. So with that, I have time for maybe a couple of questions, if anybody has any. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ray. That was fantastic. Whirlwind tour.